This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and I'm talking with Dutch Merrick. He is a prop master, an armorer, and past president of Local 44 IATSE. So welcome to our show, Dutch.
Thank you for having me, Steve. I appreciate the opportunity.
So Dutch, why don't you talk about how you got into the business of being an armorer and a worker in Hollywood?
Well, I had a roundabout way into the business, as many people have stories like that. I started out, my sport in high school was competitive shooting. So I grew up around guns and as a shooter, also with a dad that was a sheriff's deputy. That didn't hurt. And so my first show, I got on with a specialty handling guns on an ultra low budget feature film. And the prop master on that show didn't know a thing about guns and they needed to bring someone in just to handle them. So I cut my teeth in the non-union world. Over the course of that time, before I got in the union, I tried as many jobs as I could, everything from driving a truck as a non-union teamster, we call them, but it would have been non-union at the time. Done grip work, electric, camera assistant, even craft service. So I had tried to cut my teeth in each direction, and I landed in what I found to be my calling was as a prop master and armorer, and that's what I've done for 25 years since.
And you got involved in the union. Why don't you talk about how that came about and why you see being involved in the union is important to your trade, your craft, and profession?
Well, Steve, my family background is General Motors. I'm originally from Detroit. My great grandfather in Flint, Michigan in the 1930s was a machinist for Chevrolet. And that was at the time of the great sit down strikes of 1937, which was a game changer for labor in the United States. It was the first time that the auto workers had an effective rebuke to the demands of the General Motors. So we're 5 generations of UAW and union workers. So I have a sense of the value of workers united for a collective bargaining agreement. We are, after all, so much stronger when we stand arm in arm and make a collective demand than we are one-on-one showing up with the employer saying, hey, pay me a reasonable wage and give me breaks, lunch break and decent time off. So about 14, 15 years ago, I joined the executive board of my local and became what they call a craft rep, a craft representative. So my particular local is divided into several crafts, let's say 6 crafts, and that's prop masters like myself, prop makers who build things and build sets, special effects, set decorators, property people. There's several different crafts. So I was seated at the table for 12 years as a board member representing the wants and needs of fellow prop masters and armorers. And in 2019, I was elected to be president of the local. So,
and how many members are there in the local there?
Our local with retirees is about 7,300 members. Now, let me offer you a bit of context. The IATSE, all in all, the US and Canada, and again, just for clarification, that's the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. The US and Canada, we represent 153,000 members. Now, in Los Angeles alone, just the Hollywood section, there are 47,000 of those 153,000 members. So we're nearly a third of the entire IA just in one city. Now, my local, we consider that there's 13 what we call Hollywood backlot locals. And those are the various crafts that make motion pictures and television, not including stagehands for theater and trade shows and rock concerts. Of those motion picture workers, my local is 7,000 of those 47,000. So my local is the largest local in Hollywood, the largest craft local. And I'm proud to say when we had our election in 2019, change was afoot. The members wanted to see the old guard out, the old ways out, and I won my election by a margin of almost 40% against a fellow who had been there either president or vice president for about 16 years. So we could tell our membership was ready for change. And in fact, my local has an election coming up January 1st through March 31st is the election period. So people will start to be signing up to run for any one of 30 or 35 different seats available at my local.
And the industry has been demanding long hours, which is a history in your union. How has that affected the workers? Because I know that this recent terrible death in New Mexico seems to be part of the crisis facing your members and the stress and overwork.
Well, first of all, the tragedy in New Mexico is just unimaginable, and our hearts go out. My heart goes out to all the people involved, and I know all of Hollywood has united in this, and we just feel terrible for Halyna's family and for Joel, the director, who got hit as well, and all the crew members that were standing there on that day when this really preventable tragedy happened. It was certainly a chain of events that occurred that do not match the industry standards. As an armorer, I will choreograph a scene where I'll have, 10, 12 people or more that are all firing guns at one time in one scene. But by carefully choreographing that, knowing where they're going to fire, when they even put their finger on the trigger, and we make each gun safe one at a time, and then we load them one at a time, and it's the last thing before the camera rolls. So we do safety check after safety check after safety check, and clearly those processes were circumvented or avoided in this tragic incident.
And the issue of health and safety obviously is important for your union, all unions in this period. How do you think that the industry is driving a situation where health and safety standards are not followed, since this was a union production?
I'll share with you my personal experience. In my 25 years in the business, I started out on a non-union show doing 12-hour days. And coming from an 8-hour a day job, I thought that was just brutal. It was working a day and a half for every day that I used to work. When I got into union work, the hours were more manageable. I was generally working 10-hour days, which is still longer than most. And I learned to rely on the overtime that I was earning for 2 hours a day. Now, over the course of this 25 years, productions are demanding more productivity out of the workers. They want to get more in less time, in less total number of days. So it's very common for a television show crew to be working 16 hours a day. Our crews are putting in 80 to 100-hour work weeks, and it's working us to death. It's grinding our members to the bone. But this has been a gradual decline in working conditions. Now, further, they have pushed us through lunch, where often there are many shows now shooting without a lunch break, which it's unconscionable in my book.
Isn't that illegal in California?
Interestingly enough, most workers that work an 8-hour job get a lunch break at around 4 hours. But there are laws in place to protect them, to say if your employer doesn't abide by that decent treatment, you have to get a lunch break by 5 hours. Now, the motion picture industry has had lobbyists in Washington for going way back, and they have a special carve out where we don't have to have a lunch break until 6 hours. And now beyond that, there's a caveat in the contracts that say if the employer wants to push through lunch, they can pay a small penalty. Now, that penalty was established 25, 30 years ago. They pay that penalty each half hour accrues. So you pay the regular day rate, the hourly rate, plus a small penalty per half hour. That means that an employer like Netflix or Amazon or Apple that has a lot of money in the bank and they want to get a lot of product created in a short period of time can pay this minor penalty per person and work the crew members all the way through. And so we have crew members that'll work a 14, 16-hour day without even a half-hour break in the middle in which they can decompress and take their walkie-talkie out of their ear and stop paying attention to the job for 30 minutes. That's one of the many conditions that's come about in the last decade or so that has made this job harder and harder for our members.
And the recent contract fight was in part over the long hours that you and your members work. Do you think that they had something to do with that accident that took place?
The crew on Rust, as I've read, was facing really difficult conditions. They had gone for weeks without a paycheck, which people ask, how could they do that? How would the workers stay there? Well, it's Hollywood. In Hollywood, we're told that the show must go on. So we're dedicated to our crafts. And because it's a gig economy, we're what they used to call casual labor. you may not get the next job if you show some resistance during this job. So people put up with it and know that, well, maybe I'll get paid late, but I'm sure the checks are good. And hey, here's a big star aligned with it. I'm sure that the money will be there eventually. But again, here's workers that have gone weeks without a paycheck in ever declining conditions. They'd been working 14-hour days. The production had been putting some of them up in a hotel when they requested after these long days, because many of them lived an hour away in Albuquerque. Now, putting someone up in a hotel is not a great solution either, because you've eventually got to drive home. And so that takes 2 hours out of your day. Maybe you have to feed your dog or just do your laundry. Now, on top of that, this crew felt that they were being abused hours wise so badly that they brought the union out. The union representative come out, talked to the producers about limiting the number of hours worked. So what the producer did apparently was they cut the hours off at 13 and a half hours. So that means nobody was entitled to a room, but you still had as long a day as possible. The camera crew, and in my experience, camera crews are super dedicated to their director of photography and dedicated to the job. But the conditions had grown so bad that 6 or 7 members of the camera crew walked off that very morning. Now, these are elements that help create a recipe for disaster. When you add to the long hours and the crew feeling abused or dismissed, you had a first assistant director who is in a conflicting role in productions. This is one of the weak links, I think, in our system. The first assistant director is designated as the chief safety officer for a film set. So if there's a critical problem, you can go to him or her, and they will solve that problem. If it's not, whatever the problem is, it's the bottom line. It's the first AD. Now, the AD has a conflicting role as the person that is driving the crew to meet the schedule. Oftentimes, there's limitations on how long you can have a location, how long you have a piece of equipment on rental, or the sun is just going down and you're going to lose daylight. So you've got to rush to get that scene. So a first AD has a built-in flaw, I think, in driving the workforce to hurry up and make the schedule, and also being the one you report to for a safety issue. Now, add to this recipe an armorer. This 24-year-old gal was on her second picture as a key armorer. Not a lot of experience. Her previous job, I'll get to that in a second. On this job, she was hired to do a dual role, where half of her time she was a prop assistant, and the other half of the time she was the armorer. I talked to a prop master who was originally going to be hired on to the show Rust. He had put in a budget for 5 assistants. Producers pushed back and said, you're going to have 2 assistants, and one of those assistants is going to serve a dual role as a property person and an armorer. So this friend of mine refused the job, thinking that this is a recipe for trouble. Now, the first AD and the armorer both had histories with accidental discharges or gun problems in the past. On Hannah, the armorer's last show with Nicolas Cage, there was a couple of accidental discharges, and one went off that she perhaps had pulled the trigger. A gun went off without calling it out, and Nicolas Cage stormed off the set yelling at her, "You damn near blew my eardrums out." Now that's cause for alarm already. Now this first assistant director had an accidental discharge on a show with a guy handling a gun in 2019, and they were both fired on the spot. So here's 2 people in the formula, 2 people in the chain of custody of the gun, the armor and the first AD, that have both had a history of gun handling problems. The formula was there for a problem.
Now, Alex Baldwin, in a recent interview, said that he was personal friends with the cinematographer, and that he wouldn't allow something like that to happen. It was a smaller production, so they didn't have the kind of money that Apple or Netflix has. But it seems like the drive to decrease costs in smaller productions actually lead to a situation where you're not doing what you should be doing for health and safety protection.
Well, that leads me to 2 more things that were raised. Apparently, that morning they had a safety meeting in the morning, which is customary, and you would generally do a safety meeting before each scene is filmed that involved a stunt or explosions or gunfire. The reports that I have are that there was no safety meeting just before that scene was filmed. Now, the reason of that, the purpose for that safety meeting is that the first assistant director points out who is responsible for what. They might say, this is Hannah the armorer, this is so and so the stunt coordinator, this is so and so the effects person, this is so and so our fire safety officer sent by the county. If we have questions, let's go to those people. Let's talk through what we're about to do. If anybody has any questions about where to stand, are you wearing ear protection? Where is okay to be facing, and what direction we need to keep everybody clear of for their own safety? That happens in a safety meeting, and that did not happen apparently. Further, I've heard complaints that the film sets have now very specific COVID safety compliance. And I know that Hollywood is really the gold standard of COVID safety. From regular testing, everybody wears masks. They're given fresh masks consistently throughout the day. They're reminded to hand wash. We have hand washing stations. We have sanitizing bottles everywhere on a set. Those are common practice now to keep Hollywood safe so we can keep the machine going. On the set of Rust, what I've heard where there were complaints from the crew that there was inadequate COVID enforcement. So there's multiple layers of safety and protection. Is it for cost? Was it for expedience that they don't do a safety meeting so they can get through the scenes in a hurry? I can't say just yet, but we're eager to know. And please understand that this show and its practices were an anomaly. They are not the way Hollywood handles COVID safety or firearm safety or stunts. It was a very different situation than what I face every day. Hollywood fires millions of blank rounds, literally millions of blank rounds safely without a death. The last death we had from a studio gun was 28 years ago, and it was a similar set of circumstances where the chain of custody was broken, and it was an unforeseeable chain of events that were, as Alec Baldwin put it, one in a trillion event. I actually agree with him there. It's there's so many checks and balances in place on a film set that this show, Rust, was just an anathema, very different than what we experience every day in Hollywood.
And it seems like there are growing frustration, anger. You had a tremendous amount of unity around your national contract, which included the issue of hours. In this new contract proposal, which you're voting on, has it changed? Has it forced the producers to allow proper time for health and safety and for for better situation, work situation? There have been a major mobilization of IATSE members, particularly over the issue of hours of work, and also the fact that a lot of your members are having problems living economically. There is a new contract, and this incident in New Mexico has probably agitated people even more about the issue of health and safety. Do you think that this new contract deals with the issue of hours over work and what is going on in the industry?
This has been a landmark opportunity for film workers to make gains that they've lost over the last 80 years. The contract strike authorization vote that happened a couple of weeks ago had a 90% participation of the 60,000 members polled that would be affected by the contract. 90% of them cast a vote, and 98% of those were in favor of a strike authorization. That was the largest arrow ever put in the quiver of the IATSE negotiators, ever. The contract, as it was handed to us, did have some gains. For example, the lowest paid workers, Local 871, that are making $16 and change an hour, just above the proposed minimum wage, will be bumped up to $23 and something cents an hour, and then over the next 2 years get some additional raises. So it does look out for the least of ours, as well as it creates a 10-hour minimum turnaround, which, while that's a gain, many of our workers were working 8 or 9-hour turnarounds, which is just deplorable. 10 hours is still not enough. If you consider big city traffic, whether you're in LA, New York, or Atlanta, it may take you an hour each way to get to work. So that's another 2 hours carved out of your time to stop and have dinner and say hi to your family and rest. And it's just not acceptable to most of our workers. Additionally, in this contract proposal, there is no maximum hours proposed. So an employer can work your crews 24 hours straight and just pay a penalty and keep you working. There's no absolute cap. And that's frankly brutal. The thought that our workers can be pushed straight through lunch without a lunch break and a penalty isn't really meaningful until they get to 4 penalties in, and then it turns to $25 an hour. And these very wealthy companies may just pay that amount of money. Additionally, our wage increase proposal is 3%. Now, in my entire career, I've only ever seen 2.5 to 3% raises offered ever. And that has not kept up with the cost of living, particularly in these big cities. With the median cost of a house in Los Angeles approaching $700,000,
It's a
no
million in San
longer.
Francisco.
Oh, it's
The Bay
crazy.
Area, it's
That's insane.
impossible. Yeah. Workers
Well,
can't afford to live in
at
those
all.
cities.
At
Yeah.
all. So it used to be that a film crew member could have a comfortable living. It could be a single breadwinner. It could be two kids that go through college, two cars on the driveway, and a nice middle class house on one income. Now it's taking two of our people working double shifts to just get by and have an apartment. That is not a reasonable situation, I think, in the eyes of most of our IA workers. And again, if we when we raise the union standards and we negotiate for a better contract and better conditions, that raises all boats, because then even non-union shows, in order to compete for labor, then raise their standards. So it's really important at this time, I think, that the IA hold out for as much as possible and demand a decent living and demand humane conditions for our workers.
And there's a growing labor strike wave in the United States. These companies that you deal with in the film movie industry are making billions, or some of the richest companies in the world. Yet workers are struggling to survive. You think that this strike wave that's going on is going to grow?
I do. What they were calling Striketober, with UPS workers and UAW workers and the IATSE and several others, Amazon,
Bakery
all
workers, Kellogg
big,
workers. Yeah.
yes, all, yeah, for sure, all on the brink of strike. It felt like a tipping point, and I think that's going to continue. I think that people are growing more aware that collective bargaining is in their favor, it's to their benefit, and I think that the workers are gonna. They're, you know what? It reminds me of the old phrase about boiling a frog. When you a frog will jump out of hot water because they can feel it, but if you put a frog in a pan of water and you ever so slowly turn up the heat in very small increments, they just won't notice it and they'll eventually boil to death. I honestly think that's what's happened to our workers. They've been turning up the heat slowly but slowly, and it's been asking for increased productivity and lower staffing. They're increasing the profits while our members are working longer and longer hours. Sorry, I'm turning off my phone. Um, I think that
And oh,
this
go
is a
on.
tipping. I think that this can be a tipping point for labor nationwide, particularly during the pandemic, when we've seen people learn what it's like to have downtime, some time with their families, time for recreation. And in the film industry, when we came back from the pandemic, the studios ended up paying a lot more money for COVID safety and precautions, and they were working shorter days in order to keep safety precautions in place. So we had grown accustomed to 8 and 10 hour days where we could still make a decent living and have a life to ourselves. Now, that finally gave film workers a taste of what life can be like. And I think we do not want to go back to the drudgery of this grindstone mentality of 80-hour work weeks.
So this pandemic actually changed the work relations, and workers saw that they could have a better situation in the film industry.
Yes, I agree.
And the owners are still making profits.
Well, while we're working our 80-hour work weeks and falling asleep at the steering wheel on the way home, there are billionaires that go to space for lunch. That really put into high relief the drastic contrast between the shop floor workers and the owner class. And it shows to all, it lays bare the hyper acceleration of wealth into the hands of a very few people, while it's being extracted from the pockets of the rest of us. And of course, at the same time, they use major media to manipulate people's perception of this, that what's good for GM is good for America. That's what I was taught when I was a kid, but we realized that's simply not the case. And that's divided us amongst the workers that just point at the others that want better conditions, and they say, "Oh, you're just lazy." Well, no, I'm not. I actually want to get paid for the time and the effort that I put in, and I'm not dedicated to working all my free time for this major corporation.
And that raised the issue of media, the development of social media. You've been active with KPFK in Los Angeles. There is no workers channel, labor channel, and yet workers are using social media to get their stories out and to get their issues out. You think that's going to grow? And what do you think is necessary for workers to have a voice, a real voice in the media in the United States and internationally?
I believe that social media in itself is a game changer. While it does have its challenges, it can be a real problem. On the whole, social media is offering us an opportunity to connect with one another and share our experiences as never before. In the film industry in particular, there has developed a form of gallows humor where we all sort of suffer together and you sort of look sideways at it and giggle. When we're forced to work late into the night on Fridays to complete our work week, and we're working into Saturday morning, film crews came up with a catchy term called fratter days. So, for example, this week, Friday, I will be working a fratter day. The week has stretched out starting Monday morning, and on Friday, I'm probably going to be starting at about 4 or 5 p.m. And there goes my weekend because I'm going to try to get caught up on sleep on Saturday, reset my body clock, and then Sunday is laundry and get ready for a 6 a.m. call the next day. I think that there is a huge need for the workers to have a voice in popular culture and on the media. As we know, Steve, there are 5 or 6 major corporations that have gobbled up all of the media landscape. And when I say all of, I mean television news, newsprint, book publishing, billboards, CBS Outdoor and Charter Communications. These companies own major radio stations in every market, and they've eliminated the rules that limited them to one station per market. So you can listen to CBS, for example, on 6 or 7 or 8 different channels on FM radio in Los Angeles. It's all the same company. Now that has narrowed down the message and unified it in one that is just sort of blindly pro-capitalism, blindly pro-profit, and has set the human condition aside. Those voices are no longer heard. Even NPR is lacking horribly. I find that Pacifica Radio is one of the few outlets where people can speak first person to their experiences in the workforce and the challenges that they face. I think further, I think that it would be important. I know that it's important for the labor movement, which is all of us workers. Keep in mind, it's all people that are employed by an employer for a living. It's not some rarefied class or union members or anything like that. It's the workforce is all of us. Needs to have its own media. They need to have our voices so that we can share it. When I read things like labor notes or counterpunch, I get to read these stories firsthand of workers' struggle and their successes, and we can learn from each other where people have formed co-ops or they've taken over the factory and they bought it from the employer, and we can learn and build on this knowledge base. I think having a labor radio channel, labor cable TV are just they're mandatory cornerstones for rebuilding the power of the people in the US and in the West as a whole.
And next year, there's going to be a meeting of the AFL-CIO. You think there should be a fight there over developing a national labor channel with labor programming so that working class issues of workers, organized and unorganized, are on a 24-hour basis? Your rallies, your actions should be available to all working people to see what your struggle is, the struggle of Kellogg workers, the auto workers, uh, every worker that is facing really life and death situation in some circumstances, particularly with COVID.
Believe me, there's more than enough news and activity on the labor front every day to populate a full-time cable channel. And the AFL-CIO would be well advised to organize putting its money in that direction and using that as seed money to get other donations and creating a network, a channel where we can have access to that labor information broadly. I think that this has been a huge miss. And I've watched as the far right wing of the Republican Party has funded vastly think tanks to help shape the message. They've bought out ownership of the majority of AM radio stations around the country, which leads to talk radio shows, which lean very far right, so far off the charts that the people listening regularly have a very, very inaccurate view of the world. They've shown in survey after survey that if you listen to these programs, it is programming, and it really pulls you off of where the center of the dialogue is. And we need to help shape perceptions in the reality of what's going on. We need to offer a counter to that that's an effective means to educate the people and empower them to take back their own power.
And the rise of fascism, the rise of xenophobia and racism, you see that as a threat. And what should working people do about that?
Well, xenophobia, the fear of another race, has been used as a tool to leverage apart workers going back 100 or 200 years. They did it with the building of the railroads when they would bring in black workers, for example, that had been former slaves, and when they pushed back against horrible conditions and people dying because of lack of safety and lack of brakes, then what the railroad owners did, they brought in Chinese people, and so Chinese people would just take those jobs and undercut the black people of the time. And then the Chinese people got together and they said, wait a second, these conditions are deplorable. We're watching our peers die on the railway. They're not giving us decent conditions. So then they brought in Filipino workers, people with yet another language, and or Latinos, Mexican Americans. And again, they leverage us against each other time and time again through xenophobia and fear of, quote, the other. And time again, our answer has been to unite those groups, because the African Americans and the Chinese got together and said, we're not going to put up with this. And then the Filipinos joined them, and then the Irish joined them. And once we get together and get past those perceptions of difference and the other, we realize we're all in this boat the same, and we need to stop this infighting. But it is a key tool that the powerful people use against us to convince us that that other guy's out after my wallet.
I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Dutch Merrick. He is a prop master, armorer, past president of Local 44, and also past chairperson of KPFK in Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us, Dutch.
Thank you very much for having me, Steve. Feel free to reach out anytime.